I want to move to the second module, which is about policy, the policy process, STI policy making, and STI policy instruments. We've now defined what STI are all about. We now can gradually move to discussing STI policy. And to do that, I think it's important for us to, first of all, define what is policy, another commonly used term, very, very abused all over. So we need to define what policy is. Sometimes we talk of policy and confuse it with the plan, or policy and strategy, policy and even politics. So what is policy? And then what is the policy process? Where policy comes from? Policy is an outcome of a policy process. So we'll talk about the policy process, then define science, technology, and innovation policy. What then we'll then talk about policy instruments, the notion of policy, science, technology, and innovation policy instruments, and why they matter. So policy, which is not politics, is defined as a course of action or actions or courses of actions agreed upon by an authority. In our case, we'll be talking about government or governments in order to solve specific public problems. Policy is about action or actions to solve specific problems, public problems. And those actions or courses of actions are agreed upon or adopted by an authority, a legitimate authority. And in this case, it will be government, either central government or local government, but it must be some authority. An individual cannot go there and determine public policy to solve public problems. So policy is about actions, courses of actions. But I want to emphasize, and the second sentence on this slide is important, policy can also be in action, determined by a particular authority again. A particular authority, government, or if it's private policy, the private authority will decide not to do anything about the problem. So government can decide that there is a public problem, but for a range of reasons, the policy is in action, will not do anything about this problem because of a range of reasons. Because if we take action on this problem, it may undermine our economic competitiveness. So let's take climate change as an example, or pollution. Some countries decide not to do anything about this public problem, climate change or pollution, because if they take certain actions to reduce emissions, those actions may undermine their economic growth objectives or goals. So inaction can be a policy. And as I said, policy is an outcome of a policy process. And policies, again, are made through, very often through negotiations among different actors with competing interests. Those interests may be political interests, technological interests, social interests, economic interests. So even within government, you have different actors with competing interests. You can have different ministries and or departments with competing interests, different interests, and they have to get into negotiation to arrive at policy, to adopt a course of action or courses of actions. So policy is not just does not just emerge, but there is intense negotiation. Through cost benefit analysis, certain actions are determined. The policy process out of which we get policy is a non-linear process. Involves a number of steps and activities, particularly defining and structuring a real problem into a policy problem. So you have a problem out there, a real problem. You have to structure that into a policy problem. You may have the problem is that the real problem is that there are too many accidents. So you have to structure that real problem into a policy problem. The policy problem could be most of the drivers on the roads are not well trained. The accidents are not just happening because of cars, but there is a specific policy problem. The traffic lights do not work. The drivers are not well trained, or the vehicles that are on the road are not roadworthy. So you have to turn a real problem into a policy problem, and that is what we call problem definition and structuring. After you define and structure a real problem into a policy problem, you do what's called agenda setting. You have to get the various actors, the stakeholders together to agree that you have this real problem which has a policy problem, and you need to address that policy problem so that you're able to solve this real problem. Many accidents on the road, or climate change and pollution out there. So agenda setting is very important. You prepare yourself as a country to start formulating a policy. You must set the agenda. You must get the relevant stakeholders together. Then you go through analysis of the policy problem. You identify various options. For any policy problem, there must be some options. And you through cost benefit analysis, you sequence your options and say this is option 1, this is option 2, and then you select specific policy actions. You adopt your actions. This is the action, or these are the actions to address this problem. Then you move into implementation of the policy. You start implementing the policy. Not if you don't move into implementation of the policy, then you don't have a policy process. If you just end at policy adoption, your policy process is incomplete. You must get into policy implementation. And then as you implement the policy, you review, you monitor it because of time, because of technological changes, because of many factors. You find out maybe the policy is not working, you review and revise the policy. So just again emphasizing that it's not a process, it's an interactive process, not about single events. It's a process. Starting with agenda setting through to policy termination. In some cases, you terminate a policy because it cannot solve the problem, you essentially adopt a new policy. You terminate an old policy, and then you, in that process, you go back. So the policy process is continuous. It's not about a single event. There's a learning in the policy process. You find out that, in fact, because through analysis, your knowledge of the real problem gets improved. You get to understand better why you're having too many accidents, or why the problem of climate change persists, or what our actions to address the COVID pandemic are not working. So you get into learning. It's really evolutionary. You learn. There is the notion of policy learning, which has actually been well developed by Susan Boras in the book that I referred to earlier, Holistic Innovation Policy. They talk about policy learning how to develop policy, learning which policies work, which ones do not work. That's really policy learning. It's a learning process. Let me emphasize that the policy process is full of uncertainty. It's not deterministic. You cannot determine what the outcome of a policy process would be. You cannot say we are starting to develop a policy to address COVID-19, and these are the policies, and these are the impacts of the policy. You can't with certainty determine the impacts of a particular policy or particular policies. Just as with the technological change and the innovation process, you cannot predetermine their outcomes and impacts. Related to, in the policy process, we talked of a very important step, policy analysis. And I just want to introduce very briefly the notion of policy analysis. It has two facets. Inquiry for the policy process or for policy. That's where you study the policy problems in order to inform policy. You produce evidence for policy. The notion of evidence-based policy making. So you inquire, you do research to produce evidence for policy, for actions. You show that climate change is a major problem. It's impacting on economies. It's caused by emission of gases into the atmosphere. You provide that evidence so that decision makers formulate and adopt very specific actions. But also policy analysis has this other aspect, which is rarely focused on, is you inquire into policy, or you study the policy-making process. You inquire into the feasibility of a particular policy. You study the political economy of a particular policy making process, or a particular policy, why a particular action has been determined. As we said again, policy making is about negotiations. It's driven by many factors, political factors, technological factors, social factors, economic factors. And understanding these factors is important. You inquire into policy. Which policies work? Why do they work? Very often, we don't inquire into policy. We don't do analysis of policy making, the political economy of policy making, and we assume, these decisions have been just made by neutral actors. And sometimes we don't understand the dynamics. So with COVID-19, governments just have different restrictions. You move in South Africa from lockdown level 1 to level 3 and back and forth, then you start asking yourself, why are we moving back and forth with these restrictions? Or you're told, oh, tobacco is not on sale because of COVID, or alcohol is not on sale, and then you start asking yourself why. And then you'll be, because of, you start finding out why, because high unregulated alcohol consumption will lead to various consequences, particularly overburdening the health system. People are not disciplined enough in certain cultures, in certain areas. So you have to inquire into policy, why decisions, certain decisions are made the way they've been made. Now, in the study guide and in the literature, you'll find a figure, an illustration of the policy process from our agenda setting through policy evaluation, monitoring, and even termination. You terminate a policy. So I recommend that you look at the study guide. You read that section on the policy process. So what is science, technology, and innovation policy? Again, we very often we talk of STI policy. Most countries, as we'll discuss in module 4, I think, most countries are writing STI policies. They are adopting STI policies. What is STI policy? And having defined a policy, we should now be able to define STI policy. We've also defined what STI is all about. I just want to emphasize that STI policy is not a single policy. It's a regime of policies. We use the notion of STI policy here to very often to refer to a regime of policies. Many policies in a regime, and those policies are courses of actions or decisions adopted by government or a country. In some cases, and we'll discuss this, groups of countries, regional economic communities, or the continent, groups of countries through their representatives, through their governments, adopt certain decisions, courses of actions on STI. And those actions are to promote STI, to promote science, largely R&D, the conduct of science, to promote technology, the development, application, diffusion of technologies, and innovation, to promote the innovation process. But even more important is to govern STI, to govern the conduct of science, to govern research, to choose good science, to set science priorities or R&D priorities, to choose certain technologies, to govern those technologies. As we said, technologies and innovation generally do not have this internal logic to solve problems. So you have to govern them. You have to take certain decision courses of actions to govern them. You can govern them through various policies around risk management, precaution, and other kinds of policies. So STI policy, again, is a regime of courses of actions or decisions adopted by a government or a country in general, or groups of countries through their governments to promote STI and to govern STI. Please remember that it's a regime of courses of actions or decisions again, adopted by an authority to promote STI as well as to govern STI. STI policy, that regime of actions or decisions, has three interrelated pillars or facets. We talk of science policy as one pillar, technology policy, and innovation policy. And we need to understand each of these facets or pillars. Science policy has also two aspects to it. One is you're dealing with policies to promote scientific research. So you are finding of R&D policies for that. A range of policies to promote scientific research or R&D. But you also have another aspect of science policy, which is science for policy, about the use of science in policy making, the study of policy. Science for policy is as important as a policy for science. Policy for science is where you use, you design and implement policies to promote scientific research. Policy for science. Science for policy is about the use of science in policy making, the generation of evidence for policy making. Technology policy is another concept in STI policy, which is about the promotion and or regulation of technology development, technology commercialization, technology diffusion, and governance of technology in general. So you have a technology policy or technology policies, and you'll come across very explicit technology policy regimes, such as ICT policy, biotechnology policy, nanotechnology policy, just as you'll come across very specific R&D policies, health research policy, or you can come across health technology policy, very specific regimes. But the important point to note here is that you have in STI policy, you have science policy, which has policy for science or policies to promote scientific research, and science for policy, the use of science in policy making. And then you have technology policy, and then innovation policy, which again is the in theme in most countries today. Place I go to, governments are writing innovation policies or reviewing innovation policies. Innovation policies concerned with policies to stimulate and govern innovation. And we've defined innovation to be the introduction, diffusion, and application of new products, processes, practices, goods, and services. So innovation policies to promote or stimulate and govern innovation and the innovation process in particular. We'll talk about the notion of policy instruments, but with innovation policy, you have a wide range of instruments. You actually, with innovation policy, you have more of convergence of science policy and technology policy. So you have your instruments such as R&D tax credits, public procurement regulations, investment laws and regulations, and many others. We'll talk in a short while about policy instruments. Define what a policy instrument is. I want to emphasize now that typology of STI policy is important. We have what we call explicit STI policy or policy frameworks or policy regimes. I use the notion of frameworks here interchangeably with the regimes. Frameworks. Thus, you have many policies in a framework. So you have explicit STI policy. Policies that are designed deliberately to promote and govern STI. So those you find them written, there will be a white paper on STI or a national STI Act. Then you have implicit STI policy or policy frameworks, those that are not deliberately designed for STI or to promote and govern STI, but they can be applied, they can be used to promote STI. So you may find your gender policy, encouragement of or development of women and girls, social inclusion in education, in employment, in the economy, may be an implicit STI policy. It's not designed specifically for STI, but you can use it to promote STI. Then you also, in your typology, you have public sector innovation policy and private sector innovation policy. Now, public sector innovation policy, which is also becoming an area of study, is largely about policies to improve the performance and effectiveness of private sector, get private sector to innovate, to produce new services, new goods, to deliver services much better. We'll share with you, remember to share with you some work, recent work on public sector innovation. It's very important. If you don't have an innovative or innovating public sector, you are unlikely to have the innovation process well governed. You'll not be able to solve your problems. You'll not be able to develop, introduce, and deploy new technologies, new practices, new products. And then private sector innovation policy, this is essentially where you focus on promoting and governing innovation in private sector, by private sector, in private companies. Not we define the national system of innovation to be comprising of this public and private sector actors. Why does STI policy matter? Why do countries? Okay, so let me end.
Okay.
I have only I think two slides. 2 slides.
2 slides. It's good. Okay.
And I'm going to be very fast. Sorry, it's longer than a.
You're welcome.
Yes. So why STI policy matters? As I said again, you have to solve problems. You need STI to solve problems. So STI policies to ensure that STI are directed to solving particular problems. You also invest in STI because you don't have all the resources to do R&D to develop technologies. You target economic targeting, or in Asia, they talk of economic discrimination. You decide which sectors you are going to focus your R&D on, or what your R&D or STI priorities are, and policy is important for that. As we said, science for policy is crucial for inform public decisions, inform policy. You do R&D to generate evidence on COVID-19 and other societal problems. Many reasons why STI policy matters. You also deal with the issues of creative destruction challenges. You would note that new technologies are disruptive. And to govern them, you require STI policy. Again, innovation policy very critical. You need to procure and deploy new technologies. Later on in the course, we'll discuss some specific policy instruments. But I want to emphasize that there are some which are largely implicit STI policy instruments, such as public procurement, regulations, and laws. Very important innovation policy instrument. The number of studies that look at public procurement as an innovation policy instrument, because you can use those instruments, public procurement regulations, to acquire new technologies, to introduce them into your economy, to solve specific problems. Then lastly, I want to end by just emphasizing this notion of policy instruments. Policy instruments are techniques used by government authorities to purposely stimulate change to address a particular problem. They are techniques used by government, and that's how Boras and Edquist defined them. We'll send to you literature on policy instruments, a lot on policy instruments. We'll post that, upload that for you to look at. But the three interrelated STI policy instruments. You have what we call the regulatory policy instruments. These are legal measures or tools to govern social and market interactions. So you have regulations. You have biotechnology policy is largely regulatory. You regulate the introduction of genetically modified organisms into an economy or into an environment. You regulate. You have those kinds of policy instruments. They are legal measures. Your intellectual property protection regimes or laws are regulatory STI policy instruments. Then you have economic stroke financial and financial instruments, which are essentially financial incentives, and in some cases also could be financial disincentives provided to public and or private sector actors to invest in research, develop new technologies, diffuse those new technologies. Then you have soft instruments. These are voluntary measures that are used to promote STI and their policy instruments. So these days you talk of open science, for example, regimes, easy, free access to knowledge and information, scientific knowledge, scientific information. You really soft instruments, public and private partnerships, where these actors in a public, from public and private sectors engage, exchange knowledge, and they are really soft instruments. You don't force, you don't regulate, you don't enforce, but these actors voluntarily come together to engage in certain activities around STI to solve particular problems. So I'm going to end the second module at that. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this module as well. We'll have a webinar. I think it's towards the end of this month, we'll have the first webinar, during which we'll, in a very interactive way, discuss these two modules, which are really about concepts and really setting the stage for our next 4 modules. Thank you very much. Thank you.